Nobody expected the words to come from her. Inside a quiet meeting room during Team USA training camp, the conversation had already been tense for several minutes. Coaches were outlining the offensive system. Players were listening, some nodding, some silent. And then, according to people close to the situation, one voice finally pushed back. Caitlin Clark. The same player who had just electrified women's basketball with one of the most explosive rookie seasons the sport had ever seen. The same player whose games were suddenly drawing millions of viewers. The same player who had become the face of a new generation. And yet in that moment, inside that room, she reportedly had one simple question. Why was the system being built in a way that limited what she does best? At first, it sounded like a normal basketball discussion. Players ask questions all the time. Systems get adjusted. Coaches explain their reasoning. But insiders say this conversation didn't stay calm for long. Voices rose. Tension filled the room. And suddenly the situation turned into something nobody in the program had expected. Because the player asking those questions wasn't just any guard fighting for minutes. It was the most talked about player in women's basketball. And when word leaked that Clark had allegedly told someone close to the team that she might be done with this situation, the internet exploded almost instantly. Fans flooded social media with theories. Was she quitting Team USA? Was there a locker room conflict? Was the coaching staff refusing to build around their biggest star? Within hours, clips from the training camp facility started circulating online. A short video showing Clark standing quietly near the sideline during a break. A photo of her walking out of the gym alone. None of it looked dramatic by itself. But once people started connecting the dots, the story took on a life of its own. Because the truth is, this moment didn't appear out of nowhere. The tension people are talking about today had actually been building for months. Maybe even longer. To understand why that meeting became so heated, you have to go back to the moment when Clark's rise started changing the entire landscape of women's basketball. Because what happened next didn't just make her famous. It completely reshaped the sport. Long before the training camp tension, before the debates, the rumors, and the locker room whispers, one thing was already clear. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another great college player. She was becoming something much bigger. At University of Iowa, Clark played basketball in a way that fans hadn't seen before in the women's game. Deep three-pointers from near the logo. No-look passes threading through defenders. Fast break decisions that seemed to happen 2 seconds before anyone else on the floor realized what was coming. Every game felt unpredictable. And that unpredictability turned her into must-watch television. Soon arenas started selling out days in advance. Opposing teams moved games to bigger venues just to handle the crowd. Television networks suddenly realized something they hadn't seen in years. Women's college basketball ratings were exploding. Clark wasn't just putting up big numbers. She was putting on a show. By the time her college career ended, she had shattered scoring records, broken assist milestones, and built one of the largest fan bases any player in the sport had ever seen. Millions of new viewers were tuning in specifically to watch her play. But that kind of rapid rise doesn't just bring attention. It also brings pressure. Because the moment Clark declared for the WNBA draft, the expectations followed her immediately. Some analysts believed she would dominate the professional game right away. Others weren't so sure. The WNBA had veterans who had spent years mastering the league. Experienced guards who knew every defensive trick, every physical matchup, every moment when the pace of the game could shift. The question everyone kept asking was simple. Would Clark's style actually work at the professional level? Or would the transition expose weaknesses that college defenses could never exploit? When the Indiana Fever selected her with the #1 pick, the spotlight only grew brighter. Every preseason game was analyzed. Every turnover was debated. Every highlight was replayed across sports media. For Clark, there was no slow adjustment period. No quiet rookie season where she could develop without the world watching. From the very first game, the pressure was enormous. And what happened next didn't just silence critics. It completely rewrote the expectations for what a rookie could do in the WNBA. When the USA Basketball announced the roster for the 2024 Summer Olympics, most fans did what they always do. They scrolled straight to one name. Caitlin Clark. But this time, the name wasn't there. At first, people thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the list was incomplete. Maybe another announcement was coming later. After all, Clark had just finished the most talked-about college career in women's basketball history. Her games were drawing record audiences. Her highlights were everywhere. Leaving her off the Olympic team didn't seem possible. But the roster stayed the same. No Clark. USA Basketball quickly released an explanation. According to officials, the Olympic roster had largely been finalized before Clark even began her WNBA rookie season. The organization wanted to prioritize experienced players who had already proven themselves in international competition. On paper, the reasoning sounded logical. Olympic teams are usually built around veterans. Players who understand the physicality of international play. Athletes who have already competed under the pressure of representing their country. And the guards who made the roster certainly had that experience. Chelsea Gray was already one of the most respected point guards in the league. Kelsey Plum had years of international success and championship experience. Both had deep relationships within the national program. Still, the reaction from fans was immediate. Social media exploded with debates. Some people defended the decision, arguing that Clark simply needed time to adjust to the professional level before being thrown into the Olympic spotlight. Others believed the organization had just made a massive mistake. Because the sport was clearly changing. A new wave of fans had arrived, drawn in by players like Clark, Angel Reese, and Paige Buchers. Television ratings were climbing. Ticket demand was skyrocketing. And many believed Clark had become the biggest reason for that momentum. But instead of reacting publicly, Clark stayed quiet. No complaints. No angry interviews. No social media posts attacking the decision. Instead, she gave a simple response when reporters asked about it. She said she understood the decision, and that she would use the moment as motivation. At the time, most people didn't realize just how serious that statement was. Because what Clark did next would completely change the conversation around her. And suddenly, the question about whether she belonged on Team USA started sounding very different. When Caitlin Clark stepped onto the floor for her first WNBA game with the Indiana Fever, the atmosphere felt different from a normal regular season night. The arena was packed. Cameras were everywhere. And millions of people who had never watched a WNBA game before suddenly had their eyes on the screen. Everyone wanted to see the same thing. Was the hype real? The first few weeks were rougher than many fans expected. Defenses were more physical. Opponents pressured Clark the moment she crossed half court. Veteran guards tested her patience with aggressive traps and constant contact. For a moment, critics thought their doubts were being confirmed. But then something started to shift. Clark adjusted. Instead of forcing difficult shots, she began dissecting defenses with passes. Instead of rushing possessions, she slowed the game down and controlled the tempo. Every week her confidence grew, and soon the numbers started climbing. By the middle of the season, Clark wasn't just surviving in the WNBA. She was taking over games. She finished the season leading the entire league in assists, a rare achievement for a rookie guard stepping into the fastest and most physical league in women's basketball. At the same time, she ranked near the top of the league in scoring while pulling down rebounds and creating plays that had analysts replaying clips for days. But the impact went far beyond statistics. Attendance numbers across the league surged whenever Indiana came to town. Arenas that normally held half their capacity were suddenly selling out. Television ratings broke records, and broadcasters started moving Fever games to prime-time slots. It felt like the entire league was experiencing a surge of attention. And at the center of it all was Clark. Even opponents acknowledged it. Players who had been in the league for years admitted that Clark was bringing a level of attention that women's basketball had been waiting for. By the end of the season, the Fever had nearly doubled their win total compared to the previous year. A team that had struggled for relevance suddenly looked competitive again. The rookie who some doubted could handle the professional game had just delivered one of the most impressive first seasons in league history. And suddenly, the Olympic debate from earlier in the year started resurfacing. Fans weren't just asking whether Clark belonged on Team USA anymore. Now they were asking something very different. If she could dominate the WNBA like this, how could the national team afford not to build around her? But inside basketball circles, another conversation was quietly starting to take shape. Because while Clark's numbers were historic, some analysts noticed something unusual about how she was being used. Moments late in games where the ball wasn't in her hands. Possessions where the offense seemed to slow down when it should have sped up. At first it seemed like a minor coaching decision. But as the season went on, people started wondering if there was something deeper happening inside the system. And that question would eventually lead straight back to the Team USA locker room. By the time Caitlin Clark finished her rookie season with the Indiana Fever, most of the basketball world had already reached the same conclusion. She was one of the most dynamic offensive players on the planet. Her game thrives on speed, quick reads, pick-and-roll actions that force defenders to make impossible choices. The moment a defense hesitates, Clark punishes it with a deep three or a pass that slices through the lane. That style is chaotic for opponents. But it also requires freedom. And that's where the quiet debate started. Because some analysts began noticing that Clark's most dangerous weapon, her ability to control the flow of the game, wasn't always being fully unleashed. Instead, the offense often leaned toward structured sets and slower possessions. The idea behind that approach wasn't unusual. Many coaches prefer controlled systems that limit turnovers and keep players disciplined. It's a philosophy designed to maintain balance across the roster. But when you have a player who can completely break open a game with creativity, structure can sometimes feel like a cage. Late in the season, several moments stood out. In tight fourth-quarter situations, Clark occasionally went multiple possessions without touching the ball. There were sequences where the offense moved through veteran options instead of the player who had already been carrying the scoring load. Fans noticed. Commentators noticed. Even some former players began questioning whether the system truly matched Clark's style. And those conversations only grew louder once the Team USA coaching staff was revealed. Because the head coach selected for the national team was Carol Lawson. On paper, Lawson's resume was impressive. She had years of experience as both a player and coach, and her teams were known for discipline and defensive focus. But her offensive philosophy had also been criticized by some analysts for being rigid. At the college level, structured systems can work well because coaches have complete control over the development of their players. International competition, however, is different. National teams often bring together the most creative players in the world, athletes who are used to controlling games in their own ways. And when a roster includes stars like Clark, Angel Reese, and Paige Buchers, the expectation from fans is simple. Let them play. Let the talent breathe. But when early reports suggested that Team USA's system might resemble the same structured style Clark had already experienced during the WNBA season, some insiders quietly wondered if tension was inevitable. Because after months of carrying a franchise on her shoulders, Clark was about to walk into another system that might ask her to slow down again. And if that happened, one question started circulating among people close to the program. Would the most exciting player in women's basketball be allowed to play her game? Or would she be asked to fit into someone else's blueprint? What nobody realized at the time was that the answer to that question was about to get even more complicated. Because when the rest of the coaching staff was announced, one name immediately caught everyone's attention. And suddenly, the situation surrounding Clark became far more personal. When the rest of the coaching staff was revealed, most fans were focused on the players. But inside basketball circles, one name on the sideline immediately raised eyebrows. Stephanie White. On the surface, her inclusion made perfect sense. White had built a strong reputation as a coach and was widely respected around the league. Her experience, leadership, and understanding of the professional game made her a logical candidate to help guide the national team. But there was one detail that made the situation far more complicated. White was also the head coach of the Indiana Fever, which meant she had just spent an entire season coaching Caitlin Clark. For most players, that kind of familiarity might actually feel comforting. Having a coach who already understands your tendencies, your habits, and your strengths could make the transition to international play smoother. But elite athletes often look for something different when they enter a national program. They want a reset, a new environment, a different perspective, a fresh voice pushing them to expand their game. Clark, however, didn't get that reset. Instead of stepping into a completely new system, she was now surrounded by many of the same ideas and coaching philosophies she had already experienced throughout the WNBA season. And that raised an uncomfortable question. Would Clark truly be evaluated with fresh eyes? Or would the same expectations follow her into the national team? Some analysts pointed to moments during the Fever's season that hinted at a possible disconnect. There were stretches where Clark's offensive freedom seemed limited, especially late in games when possessions slowed down and structured sets took over. Again, that didn't necessarily mean the coaching decisions were wrong. Coaches often prioritize balance, defense, and team chemistry over individual dominance. But when the most explosive player on the floor isn't always the one controlling the offense, people start asking questions. Now imagine carrying that same dynamic into Team USA. Inside the locker room, Clark wasn't just competing against opponents anymore. She was competing for minutes with two of the most established guards in the program, Chelsea Gray and Kelsey Plum. Both were Olympic gold medalists. Both had years of experience representing the United States in international tournaments. And both had strong relationships within the national team structure. In programs like Team USA, those relationships matter. Coaches value players who already understand the system and have proven they can perform under Olympic pressure. So even though Clark's rookie season numbers were historic, there was still no guarantee she would immediately take over a starting role. From a basketball perspective, the competition made sense. But from Clark's perspective, the situation was more complicated. After months of proving herself at the highest level of the professional game, she was walking into another environment where the hierarchy had already been established. And that's when the first signs of real tension reportedly started appearing. Because once training camp began, Clark wasn't just observing the system anymore. She was questioning it. And the moment she decided to speak up was the moment everything changed. When Team USA gathered for training camp ahead of the FIBA Women's Basketball World Cup qualifiers, the atmosphere at first looked exactly how you'd expect. Elite players laughing during warm-ups. Coaches outlining strategy. Cameras capturing the excitement of one of the most talented rosters ever assembled. On paper, the lineup was stacked. Guards like Chelsea Gray and Kelsey Plum brought championship experience. Rising stars like Angel Reese and Paige Buchers represented the new wave of talent transforming the sport. And right in the middle of it all was Caitlin Clark, the player who had arguably become the biggest draw in women's basketball. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But according to people familiar with the situation, tension had already begun to build during the early practices. It wasn't dramatic at first. Just small moments. Clark asking questions about spacing. Discussions about the pace of the offense. Conversations about how guards would be used within the system. Those kinds of discussions happen in every training camp. Competitive players care deeply about how teams are structured, and strong personalities often challenge ideas in order to make the group better. But this situation slowly became more intense. Because the system being introduced under Carol Lawson appeared to emphasize controlled possessions and strict play sets. For some players, that structure felt comfortable. For Clark, whose game thrives on improvisation and fast decision-making, it may have felt limiting. During one meeting where the coaching staff was explaining offensive concepts, Clark reportedly raised a direct question about how the guards would be allowed to operate in pick-and-roll situations. Sources say she wasn't disrespectful. She didn't raise her voice. She simply wanted clarity. Why were certain actions being restricted when the roster included several guards who excel in open, creative systems? At first, it was just basketball talk. Then the tone reportedly shifted. Lawson responded firmly, explaining the importance of discipline and team structure. The national program had a system that had worked for years, and every player needed to commit to it. But Clark continued pushing for answers. Not aggressively, just persistently. And that persistence reportedly made the room uncomfortable. Because when the most talked-about player in the sport questions the strategy in front of the entire team, everyone suddenly becomes aware that something bigger might be happening. The discussion eventually ended. Practice continued. But people close to the program say the energy inside the gym felt noticeably different afterward. Clark became quieter, more focused, less talkative during breaks. And sometime later, two words reportedly started circulating among people connected to the team. "I'm done." No one publicly confirmed exactly when those words were said or what context surrounded them. But once the rumor reached social media, the reaction was immediate. Fans began speculating that Clark might be considering stepping away from the program entirely. Videos from the training facility started spreading online. Photos showing Clark sitting apart from teammates during certain moments began getting analyzed frame by frame. None of the images actually showed a confrontation. But in the age of the internet, perception moves faster than facts. And within hours, the story had turned into something much larger than a disagreement during practice. Because many fans didn't see this as a simple coaching debate. They saw it as proof that a deeper struggle was happening inside Team USA. A struggle between the old system and the new generation that was changing the sport. Once the rumors about the training camp tension started spreading, the conversation quickly moved beyond a single meeting. Fans began asking a much bigger question. Was this really just a disagreement about offensive plays? Or was something deeper happening inside USA basketball? Because if you step back and look at the bigger picture, the situation starts to look very different. For years, the women's national team operated with a clear structure. Veteran players built relationships with the program through multiple tournaments. They learned the system, earned trust from coaches, and gradually became leaders inside the locker room. That structure helped Team USA dominate international basketball for decades. But the sport is changing. And the rise of players like Caitlin Clark has accelerated that change faster than anyone expected. Clark didn't just arrive as a talented rookie. She arrived as a cultural phenomenon. Her games were drawing record-breaking television audiences. Merchandise sales across the league were skyrocketing. Cities were moving games to larger arenas whenever the Indiana Fever came to town. In many ways, Clark became the face of a new era for women's basketball almost overnight. But when a new star rises that quickly, it can create tension inside systems that were built long before she arrived. Veterans like Chelsea Gray and Kelsey Plum had already earned their places through years of international competition. They had won championships, built chemistry with coaches, and proven themselves on the Olympic stage. From the perspective of the national program, loyalty to those players makes sense. But from the perspective of fans watching Clark dominate the professional league, the situation feels different. They see a player producing historic numbers. They see arenas selling out whenever she plays. And they wonder why the system doesn't immediately shift to highlight that talent. That's where the real debate begins. Is Team USA supposed to reward seniority, or showcase the best players performing right now? Inside the program, the answer has traditionally been balance. But balance becomes difficult when the spotlight around one player grows this large. Because every decision suddenly gets interpreted through a different lens. If Clark plays fewer minutes, people assume she's being held back. If veterans start games ahead of her, fans question whether the system is protecting the old hierarchy. And if Clark herself starts pushing back against the structure, the situation becomes even more complicated. That's why the training camp tension sparked such an intense reaction online. Many fans didn't see it as a simple disagreement. They saw it as the moment when the new generation of stars finally collided with a system that had controlled the sport for years. And the stakes of that collision are much bigger than one qualifying tournament. Because the performances in these games could shape the roster decisions for the next major international competitions, including the 2028 Summer Olympics. For Clark, that tournament could represent the biggest moment of her career. An Olympic Games played on home soil in the United States. The kind of stage every athlete dreams about. But before that moment arrives, one important question still has to be answered. Can this team actually make the system work for its biggest star? Or will the tension we're seeing now continue to grow as the spotlight gets even brighter? The tournament itself might not sound huge at first. It's a qualifying event connected to the FIBA Women's Basketball World Cup. A stepping stone, technically. One of those competitions that casual fans normally overlook while waiting for something bigger like the Olympics. But this one feels different. Because for the first time in years, people outside the traditional basketball world are actually paying attention. And a huge reason for that attention is Caitlin Clark. Over the past year, Clark hasn't just built a fan base. She's pulled millions of new viewers into women's basketball, people who previously had never watched a WNBA or international game in their lives. Television executives noticed it. Sponsors noticed it. Even opposing teams noticed it when their arenas suddenly filled up the moment Clark arrived. That kind of attention changes expectations. Now when a national team tournament happens, fans don't just want to see solid team basketball. They want to see the best players fully unleashed. They want to see the stars do what made them famous in the first place. Which is exactly why the current situation feels so tense. Because if Clark steps onto the floor and dominates the way she has in the WNBA, the entire narrative around Team USA could shift overnight. But if she struggles, or if she's placed in a role that limits her influence, the conversation could explode even further. Suddenly, every possession will be analyzed. Every rotation will be questioned. Every coaching decision will be dissected by millions of viewers who are still learning the inner politics of the sport. That's the reality when a player's popularity reaches this level. The spotlight doesn't just follow them. It magnifies everything around them. And honestly, that's one of the reasons this story has captured so much attention online. People aren't just watching for the results anymore. They're watching to see how the system reacts to a player who's changing the entire business of the sport. If you've been following this situation closely, you've probably noticed how fast the conversation keeps evolving. One day it's about roster decisions, the next day it's about coaching strategy, and suddenly the entire basketball world is debating what should happen next. That's exactly why stories like this keep blowing up so quickly. And if you enjoy deep breakdowns of moments like this, the behind-the-scenes tension, the decisions shaping the future of the game, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update when things inevitably get even more interesting. Because the reality is, we're probably still in the early chapters of this story. And the next few weeks could determine whether this Team USA roster becomes one of the most exciting teams ever assembled. Or one of the most controversial. Because when a roster this talented comes together, chemistry becomes everything. And right now, that chemistry is still a giant question mark. Right now, the most important detail in this entire story is surprisingly simple. Caitlin Clark hasn't officially walked away from Team USA. Despite the rumors, despite the internet speculation, despite the clips and photos circulating online, there has been no public announcement saying she quit. And that matters. Because it means the story isn't over yet. In fact, the most important part may still be ahead. The upcoming tournament will be one of the first real steps toward building the roster for the next global competitions, including the FIBA Women's Basketball World Cup and eventually the 2028 Summer Olympics. For many players in the program, these early tournaments act as auditions. Minutes matter. Roles matter. The way players perform under pressure can shape how coaches build the next Olympic roster years in advance. That means every possession Clark plays in this tournament could influence how she's viewed inside the national program moving forward. If she thrives within the system, the conversation about tension will probably fade quickly. Winning tends to erase most conflicts. But if the system struggles to unlock her strengths, the debate will only grow louder. Because by now, millions of fans have seen what Clark can do when she's given the freedom to control the pace of a game. Deep threes. Lightning-fast passes. Moments where she seems to bend the rhythm of the entire court around her decisions. That creativity is what drew new audiences into women's basketball. It's what turned casual viewers into dedicated fans. And it's exactly what people are hoping to see on the international stage. But this situation isn't only about Clark. It's also about the future direction of the sport itself. Players like Angel Reese and Paige Buchers represent a new generation that grew up in the era of social media, massive college audiences, and global attention around women's basketball. Their arrival has accelerated the growth of the sport in ways that even longtime insiders didn't predict. Ticket sales are climbing. TV deals are expanding. Young fans are discovering the game for the first time. But attention only lasts if the product on the court continues to deliver. And that means giving the biggest stars room to shine. Right now, Team USA has one of the most talented collections of players it has ever assembled outside the Olympics. If the chemistry clicks, this group could produce some of the most exciting basketball the women's game has ever seen. But if the tension inside the system continues to grow, the spotlight could turn into pressure. The kind that forces difficult decisions from everyone involved. Coaches, players, even the organizations guiding the future of the sport. Because one thing is certain, women's basketball has officially entered a new era. The attention is real, the audience is massive, and the expectations surrounding stars like Caitlin Clark are bigger than anything the sport has experienced before. Now the only question left is whether the system built around the national team is ready for that reality, or whether the players themselves will end up redefining it. Either way, the next chapter of this story is coming fast. And once the games begin, every decision, every rotation, every play call, every moment on the court, will reveal exactly where the future of this sport is headed. If you made it this far in the video, drop your honest opinion in the comments. Do you think Clark should stay and fight through the system, or should Team USA completely reshape the offense around her? And if you want more stories breaking down the biggest moments in women's basketball, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because the next update in this story might change everything.